Last week, I thought summer would end like every other year, with boxes taped shut, late cicadas under the porch light, and a quiet ride to campus before dawn. I had 4 days left at my parents' downsized rental, a squat shingled place that never warmed even when the sun sat on it. The air in the hall smelled faintly of cardboard and lemon cleaner. When night came, the rooms felt bigger than they were, the kind of big that makes ordinary sounds look like strangers in the dark. That first night, a tapping started under my bedroom floor, quick and regular, like a pencil on a desk. I lay still and counted between breaths. The temperature had dropped with a dry breeze, and the boards had their own language, but this rhythm did not wander. It settled under my bed and stayed. I told myself the crawl space held pipes that needed to cool. I told myself the house was learning me, and I was learning the house. The lamplight put a circle on the ceiling. I watched it as if it could answer. The tapping paused and returned with the same spacing. Ordinary sounds do not keep time. Morning erased it the way sun erases breath on glass. Coffee steamed in a chipped mug, and the kitchen window showed a thin strip of river behind the fence. My mother had labeled every box with block letters, and the marker smell still hung over the dining room. I ran errands, folded shirts, and told myself the night had exaggerated nothing sounds into something. By afternoon, heat pooled in the drive, and a neighbor watered petunias with a soft hiss that carried across the hedge. In the shed, I found a coil of red nylon cord, a jar of screws, and a small brass key tied to the cord as if someone wanted to keep it visible. The key had no tag, just a faint scratch near the bow that looked like the number 17. I put it back where it hung. When the sun dropped, the river smell pushed through the screen, damp and mineral, and the house cooled to a clean chill. I read for an hour and clicked off the lamp. The tapping waited only a little while to begin. It did not sound impatient. It sounded like someone keeping a promise quietly only I could hear. I told myself to test it. I lay my palm on the floorboards and felt a faint vibration, not the scattered tremor of pipes, more like the body of a clock. The crawl space hatch sat behind the laundry machines, a square cut in plywood screwed shut with 4 corroded fasteners. We had been told the place had no basement, only utilities under joists and sand. The screws had paint on them like rings on a tree. I listened there with my ear close and got detergent scent and the dry rattle of ducts, but no tapping at that angle. Back in my room, the sound returned as if my moving had moved it. It tapped exactly where my pillow had been. I said the word raccoon and tried it in my mouth. It did not fit the air. I turned on a box fan to mix the noise with wind and tried to sleep in the stirred cool. The fan made a steady sheet of sound, but the rhythm still stepped through it. I counted again, the same number between taps, the same patient pace. Outside, a barge horn sounded once, low and long across the water. At night, on the third night, I chose to look outside before the sound began. Heat had broken, and the air along the side yard had that green damp scent of watered soil. Against the foundation sat a leaning stack of cracked pavers, a torn tarp, and to concrete blocks with rust stains like old tears. I moved 1 block and found a metal edge beneath the tarp, painted the same dull color as the siding. The tarp peeled back with a soft rip to show a storm door fitted flat to the ground. Its handle was cold even in summer. A chain looped through the hasp, held by a cheap padlock with a brand name I recognized from garage cabinets. I had a tool bag in the shed with a flat bar and a light. I did not fetch it. I stood there with the river breeze on my face and told myself this was an old bulkhead sealed when the house changed owners. The tapping did not wait for bedtime that night. It started while I watched the door. It sounded like a knock from below. Grass brushed my ankles, and a snail shell clicked under my shoe by accident. I slept with the window open to keep the river smell near and the air moving. Every small click in the walls had a new shape, but the tapping held its place like a metronome only I could hear. In the shed, the brass key hung on its red cord where I had left it. The number on the bow looked more deliberate in morning light, a shallow scratch that caught dust. I took the key down and set it in my pocket, then put it back. My hands remembered both motions. Before lunch, I searched for papers, anything about renovations, and found only a folder of permits stamped with dates to owners old. Nothing mentioned a basement. The afternoon wind pressed the maple against the siding with a dry rub. I stood at the storm door and felt the ground cool my knees through denim. The padlock had a nick near the shackle that looked like teeth. The seam at the frame exhaled a thread of air that smelled like wet iron. I held the key again and felt how light it was. Would it turn this lock or wake something I did not understand? Under the maple? Waiting? I chose afternoon light to try the lock because afternoon felt honest. Warm sun on my neck, cool shade at my knees, river wind moving the grass in soft lines. The key slid into the padlock with less resistance than I wanted. It turned, and the shackle popped with a dull clack that sounded larger than it was. The chain came away in my hand with flakes of paint. I lifted the storm door, and a smell rose that mixed soil, old rubber, and something sweet like spoiled fruit. Steps dropped to a concrete floor. My phone light turned dust into glitter. The air was colder, the kind that holds sound in place. Boxes stood along a wall in 3 neat stacks, each labeled with marker crossed out by another hand. At the far post, someone had scratched lines in vertical groups of 5. A jar of nails sat open beside a plastic fork and an empty water bottle with a date 3 weeks old. On a beam, someone had carved the shape of a person with a crown, then crossed it out slowly. Something metallic ticked in the corner, steady as cooling tin after a long day of heat. I kept the beam in my light and moved sideways to keep dust out of my mouth. A sleeping pallet lay on 2 skids with a blanket folded to a careful line, as if its owner had left on purpose and planned to return. Food wrappers made a small drift near a bucket, mostly canned peaches and crackers, all stamped with the same store brand. The wall near the post held drawings done with the dull edge of a screw, people and animals arranged like a parade that had gone wrong. Eyes were scratched out on some and enlarged on others. By the steps, a brown envelope lay under a brick. Inside, I found a paper strip cut from a map with a red line drawn through a grid square. In the margin, the number 17 appeared again, this time clear in pencil beside the letters M, and the paper smelled faintly of engine oil. When I turned it over, my light caught a smear like ash. The smear came off on my thumb, gray and soft. I put the strip back and listened for breathing. The concrete pressed cold through my solace and steadied my shaking calves there. I climbed back into sun and let the door settle so the hinges did not shout. The air felt warmer by 10 degrees and cut grass smell replaced the basement sour. I called my father first because he is the person I call when a problem looks like a tool could fix it. He told me to lock it and to call the landlord. The landlord answered with a voice that carried drywall dust, said he had no record of a basement, said he would drive over tomorrow. I described the pallets, the dates on the bottles, the marks on the post, the map strip with M and 17. He cleared his throat and asked me to keep the door secured. Before dinner, I bought a new padlock at the hardware store, the same brand with a higher number and a heavier chain that smelled like oil, even through the plastic wrap. Back home, I laced the chain through the hasp and pulled it tight until the links sang. Evening light laid a long bar across the yard. In my pocket, the brass key felt warmer than the air. I washed my hands twice, but the smell still clung afterward. Sometime after midnight, the yard woke up. The chain rattled hard against the metal lip of the door, the way hail rattles gutters, sudden then steady. I sat up before my mind sat up. Cool air from the window carried the smell of damp dirt and iron. The rattling stopped. Then a fist hit wood twice, spaced apart like a person thinking between tries. I walked to the window and pushed the curtain only an inch. Moonlight made the grass look like water. A figure crouched at the hatch with shoulders hunched and a cap low. When the chain held, the figure stood, turned, and ran across the yard in a smooth line that did not falter. I could not tell height or age, only a shape that knew exactly where to put its feet. I called the police and described what I had seen. They came with flashlights and steady boots and found prints where the dirt was softer near the maple. The officer wrote on a pad and told me to keep the lock on and the lights on. What if the hatch was not the only door? I did not sleep until the birds started calling outside. The landlord arrived with a tape measure and a set of photocopied plans that smelled like toner. He had the habit of breathing through his teeth when he thought. We opened the hatch together and kept our shoes clean by stepping on the edges of the steps. He stared at the pallets, the marks, the map strip under the brick. He said the house sat over an old drain line that cut toward the river, a relic from when the street flooded every other spring. He traced a square on his plan with a finger and said the drain had an access somewhere near the hedge. Outside, I pulled weeds until my nails filled with grit and found a round iron lid set level with the soil. A faded maintenance tag lay nearby with the letters MR and the number 17 stamped, not scratched. The landlord rubbed his thumb over it until the blue ink looked new. He said the city once keyed series like that for seasonal checks. He did not know who still had copies. I put the tag in a sandwich bag and watched the wind move dust along the lid. Who else had the same key? A week later, I drove east to help my brother with a volunteer search along a farm road that cut through dry fields. Late afternoon light made the stubble glow and turned the metal guardrail the color of bone. A sedan had been found empty near a culvert, driver's door ajar, no hazards, no footprints anyone would swear to. The sheriff had asked for extra eyes because the ditches ran into a scrub belt nobody cleared anymore. My brother handed me a radio and told me to watch for boot prints, wrappers, anything out of place. Heat lifted off the asphalt in wavering lines. The smell came and went between dust and swamp, a shallow pool hidden by reeds. We paired off and moved at a steady pace, checking fence lines and the soft edges near water where tracks might hold. I had the key on its red cord in my pocket because I still had not returned it to the nail. Warm metal against fabric reminded me when I shifted. We found the shack by accident when a crow lifted and showed where brush dipped. Its door hung open. The hinges creaked once, then went silent like a breath. Inside, it smelled of mouse and damp wood. Dust floated in the light like insects pinned in place. On a workbench sat 3 empty bottles, same store brand I had seen at the house, lined up with their labels facing out. A sleeping bag lay rolled but not tied. On the back wall near the floor, a clean hole showed daylight like a coin. The splinters pointed inward and the shape was too neat for rot. The deputies traded a look and marked it in a notebook. My brother called it in while I photographed the bench and the floor with my phone. Near the threshold, someone had chalked a pair of letters over and over on the concrete. The letters looked like M and R, then a pause, then a small 17, each grouping smudged as if a boot had rubbed it. Outside, reeds brushed the walls with a dry hiss. I slid my hand along the bench and caught a black grease line on my palm. The lines smelled like old engines. In one corner, a taped box held nuts and washers sorted by size. The lid fluttered when the door moved and then settled again softly inside. The deputies asked us to step back while they photographed and measured. Their flash units made sharp white squares that hurt my eyes even through daylight. One of them set a marker by the hole and another dusted the door latch. They thanked the volunteers and then cleared the area so a larger team could work. We walked the ditch line for another hour without finding more than a broken glove and a flattened can. The sun dropped and took the heat with it. Frogs started up in the shallow water like a new machine warming. 2 days later, I drove back between shifts to see whether the search had spread. The shack was gone. Grass pressed flat showed where its footprint had been, and a rectangle of darker dirt held the shape of the floor. Reeds leaned over the spot as if they had been brushed hard. The air smelled clean after rain that had not fallen here. I stood in the ditch water to cool my ankles and counted to 50 and got no answer. A truck passed on the road and left a ribbon of diesel that faded. The radio on my belt clicked and stayed quiet. Back in town, I took the map strip from its envelope and compared it to a city grid posted on the records office wall. The lobby smelled like wax and copier heat. A clerk watched me trace with a finger and asked what I was looking for without looking nosy. I told her I was curious about the letters MR near a drain lid. She said the initials used to stand for Mill River when the storm lines were marked by district, and the numbers matched the sequence for service points along the south bank. She shrugged and said the program ended years ago when budgets shifted. I thanked her and stepped outside into heat that had collected under the portico. The river itself ran brown and flat under a low bridge. A heron stood in the shallows like a marker. If the person in the basement had used that route, they could move along the bank without the street seeing. If the shack had been way station rather than home, someone might be clearing paths instead of living in them. I felt the brass key through the pocket cloth and counted the teeth with my thumb until my nail hurt. When I returned to the rental, the yard looked ordinary on its face. A brown moth beat itself against the porch bulb. The chain on the hatch sat where I had set it, grease still bright at the links. Near the hedge, soil showed a crescent where a root had been lifted and set back. The iron lid near the maple had a new scuff on its paint that my fingertip could feel. Inside, the room smelled like dust warmed by afternoon sun. I set my bag down and listened without turning on the fan. At first, I heard only the house. Then, the tapping returned at a softer volume, like someone counting in the next room. My phone buzzed with a number I did not know. I answered and heard wind and a long scrape that could have been a truck or a shovel. The call ended. I stood in the hall with the key on its cord tangled around my fingers until they ached. How many doors did I not know yet? I checked the back steps and found a damp footprint shaped by bare toes. It dried while I watched and left a pale outline on stone. I decided to follow the river where the map strip drew its red line. Late August air had that thin cool under the heat that means the month is done. I parked near a service road and walked along a berm where reeds ticked my legs and dragonflies stitched blue threads over water. The bank widened into a gravel shelf where campers sometimes left fire rings of blackened stones. No one else was there. The light lowered and turned the surface copper. I set a small camera on a post facing the culvert mouth marked with a faded 17 stenciled in paint. My plan was simple: stay out until full dark and see who used the path I had learned. I ate from a tin and kept my hands clean to feel small changes in the air. When night settled, a steady drip began inside the culvert. The sound carried like a metronome in a tile room. Far off, a handheld light moved in a slow arc and then went still. I did not call out. I turned my light off and waited. The smell of algae deepened and cool air flowed from the pipe like breath in the reeds. The moving light clicked off as if a switch had been pinched. For a moment, the bank felt empty, and then brush to my left thrashed with a run that chose speed over care. I stood and backed toward the culvert where the ground stayed flat. The first shape I saw was only darkness moving darker, then a shoulder, then a cap, then the line of a forearm. The figure closed the distance without words. Gravel rolled under my heel and filled my shoes. I raised my arm and held my light low, not to blind, only to mark my place. The person came on and hit me at the chest with both hands. The air left me. We fell sideways. Rocks pressed my ribs and the smell of river mud came up. I caught the red cord in my fingers because it was already in my hand. The key knocked against my knuckle with a small metal ring. A breath touched my face that smelled like peaches going sour. I turned my head and pushed hard. My shoulder struck a culvert flange and sent a dull note into the pipe. The sound seemed to startle him for 1 second. Inside the culvert, a waist-high service gate blocked the first bend. A small brass cylinder lock sat in a square plate stamped MR17, water-lapped at rubber boots I had worn because river stones lie. I slid the key into the cylinder by feel. It turned with a click that did not echo. I lifted the gate and slipped through sideways, skin scraping cold metal. The figure grabbed for the panel and missed, fingers slapping water. I lowered the gate and felt the weight settle. My breathing made white shapes in my light. On the bank, my camera light blinked from where it had fallen, casting a pale pulse. The figure paced along the outside and then went still. I could hear his breath at the seam, shallow and quick. The culvert air smelled like iron and algae and stale fruit. I held the gate with both hands for a long minute until the pressure eased. Pebbles clicked as feet moved away into brush. The drip inside the tunnel kept time and steadied me. My forearm throbbed where the rocks had bruised it, and a thin line of blood ran to my wrist and cooled fast in shade. I stayed behind the gate until the night settled back into normal sounds. When I came out, the camera had cracked its screen, but it still held the file. In the car, I watched enough to confirm shapes and distances and times. The light had captured the moment the figure rushed and the second his hands hit the panel. I drove to the station and handed over the video and the maintenance tag copy I had made. The desk sergeant listened and then called a detective who asked plain questions. He said they would check keys and inventory and asked me to stop going alone. The river air followed me into the lobby and stayed there like I had brought weather in my clothes. At home, I set the brass key on the table and watched moisture beat on its edges from the colder metal meeting warm air. My ribs hurt when I breathed deeply. I turned off the lamps and sat in the dark to let my eyes return to night. In the quiet, I could hear a drip that was not in my house. It was in my head, slow and even, counting down the room at night. Morning brought the ordinary back in pieces. Coffee steamed, the porch boards warmed, a neighbor dragged a bin and let it thump on the curb. I stepped into the yard to check the hatch and found dew thick on the chain. No marks showed on the soil. In the shed, I hung the key by its red cord on the same nail where I had first seen it. The shed smelled like cut wood and motor oil and dry dirt. In that mix, I could still pick out the faint fruit smell that had followed me from the tunnel. The scent made no sense out here. I stood with my hand on the nail until my palm took the chill from the metal. The house behind me held quiet. At the river a heron would be standing already in the same square foot of water. I went back inside and sat on the floor beside my bed and breathed the room until my ribs hurt less. No tapping came. Quiet landed like a sheet and stayed. The cost of quiet is that you hear what you brought back with you. It waits behind ordinary sounds and reminds you to listen. After the river night, 3 threads lay on the table where I could see them. The house with its hidden door and careful pallets. The shack that came and went like a bad tooth you press with your tongue. The culvert gate that opened for a key I should never have had. All 3 shared the same markings, the same number, the same letters rubbed into corners like a habit someone could not drop. I listed what had changed. The basement was no longer a rumor. The landlord filed new plans. The police held a copy of the video and told me not to speak online while they worked. I listed what had not changed. Whoever had kept time beneath the floor still knew the yard. Whoever had stood at my tent that night a year ago still knew how to move in silence. The river still carried anything light toward the bridge and under it. The smell of peaches still showed up where peaches were not. I wrote the letters MR on a card and set it by the key to keep the pattern honest. Patterns hold you steady when fear tries to turn facts into fog at night. 2 weeks later, the detective called and spoke in a tone that carried paper. He said the tag series had belonged to a decommissioned municipal route and some keys had never been collected. He would not say how many. He said crews had found a second hatch near an old pump house with signs of traffic but no camp. He asked me to confirm the permit dates I had mentioned, the folder with stamps 2 owners old. I told him the month and year and the color of the ink because I remember small things when I am afraid. He said the map strip matched a grid used along the South Bank when lines were checked in late summer before the fall storms. The explanation was simple and not comforting. Old systems leave doors. Doors collect people who like to travel under sight lines. When I hung up the phone, the afternoon smelled like hot dust. A lawnmower 2 houses away throbbed behind fence boards. I looked at the nail in the shed where the key hung and saw a clean circle where the sun had kept paint from fading behind it. The circle looked like a small clock. I made a rule that sounds dull and kept it. I do not leave doors without knowing who else holds a key. I do not sleep with a mystery I can put on paper. If a noise repeats with the same spacing, I give it a name and a place on a page. If a mark repeats on wood and concrete, I take a photograph and note the light. I run small experiments during daylight because night makes guesses look like answers. I keep a record of what the air smells like when something starts and when it ends. These habits let fear cool to room temperature. They do not make you safe. They make you present, and presence is what carries you through the hours between midnight and morning. The brass key still hangs on its red cord where my hand can find it without looking. The cord fades a little more each week, and the knot tightens from humidity. When I touch it, the metal feels colder than the shed air, even at noon, and that reminds me to check the chain on the hatch without waiting for a sound to begin. I check the lid to daily. Winners in this story are small facts written down before panic edits them. The clerk who remembered district letters wins because memory held a shape others forgot. The landlord who filed new drawings wins because paper keeps future hands honest. The heron wins because the river still gives it a square foot to stand on even when men plan other paths. Losers are the shortcuts that make trouble invisible. The disappeared shack loses because it taught me to notice missing rectangles and the color of dirt beneath buildings. The person who kept time under my floor loses because time left behind points to a person as clearly as a footprint. I think of the peach's smell and hope it led the right people to the right door. At sunset, the bridge throws a long shadow over the slow water. Under that shadow, you can still see trash drift and touch a tag with a number. Nothing has ended. What has changed is that I now know where to stand when the light goes low to see who comes up the bank and who goes down. Knowing where to stand makes fear smaller without pretending danger is gone for now only. On the last Sunday before classes, I swept the porch and shook the mat. The air had that first crisp from nights that cool faster than days. When I set the broom back in the corner, I saw a dusty mark near the door sill, a small 7 beside a thin one made by a fingertip or a glove with grit. It could have been anything. It could have been a trick of light and dust. I knelt and looked closer until my knees pressed a pattern into the paint. I wiped the mark with a damp cloth and watched it smear and lift, leaving clean wood that would tell me if it came back. I stood and listened to the house. No tapping. The river made its long sound under everything. A peach pit lay in the hedge as if a bird had dropped it. I set it in the trash and went inside to finish packing. The key hung where it always hangs, bright and patient. At night, it shines like a small coin in a jar. When I turn off the light, what sound will keep time next? Will I hear it before I name it again?